Thank you for joining us bright and early this morning for our first panel of the day. We had a really great day yesterday. We're looking forward to some great panels today. And we are starting today with polling the down ballot, lessons learned from next cycle and beyond. Brought to you by the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics and the Cook Political Report. I'm Jessica Taylor, and I'm the Cook Political Report Senate and Governor's Editor. And with us today are two individuals that I'm really excited about and honored to introduce. Brenda Gianiny is the founding principal of Access Research and a nationally recognized expert in public opinion research. Gianiny is well known for her work on Republican political campaigns, having served as the primary polling contact for the George W. Bush White House for the Bush-Cheney 2004 re-election campaign, and for Senator Mitch McConnell's 2020 re-election campaign. She has also worked for companies like Walmart and ExxonMobil. Brian Stryker is a partner at ALG Research and manages the firm's Chicago office. He specializes in Midwestern politics, having successfully polled for candidates such as Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer and Indiana Senator Joe Donnelly. Internationally, Stryker worked as the lead advisor to Nigeria's now President Muhammadu Buhari, as well as in Haiti, Nicaragua, and Algeria. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, Brenda and Brian. We are going to get started. I'm going to give each of them just a few minutes to sort of give an overview of lessons that they've seen from working on down ballot campaigns. Brenda has worked on a lot of Senate campaigns this past cycle. Brian did a lot of House races. So we have sort of not only different political views here represented, but also sort of the different down ballot races. And we're going to start with Brenda.
Well, thank you, Jessica. I think I speak on behalf of both Brian and I. Say we're happy to be here. I'm always happy to talk polling and learn from others of how we can get better, looking forward into 2022 and beyond. So I'm just going to go through a few slides to kind of share what we saw in 2020, what we learned, and how we can use that as we look forward to the next cycle. The first one that I spend a ton of time educating people on, there we go, if my slides will advance, is there is a big difference between media polls and campaign polls. So media polls, I know those are the polls that you're most likely to see. They get covered ad nauseum, both on the local level and even on the national level. And it's good. It's good to have that data and that information out there, but they're for completely different reasons, completely different objectives. Media campaigns are designed, I always say, for eyeballs or for clicks. It's designed to get eyeballs to the screen, to get people to stay on articles as long as they can. And it is to inform as well, but the main objective is to get people to click on those stories. Campaign polling is 100% different. We do focus obviously on the ballot, but it's much more about what's our strategy moving forward. What is the message that is resonating that our candidates have? What are voters responding to? What else is in the candidate's platform that voters are receptive to, that we should be talking more about? Who is moving? Who is available to us? Who may be moving away? So it's really much more about next steps and where do we take the campaign from there. And that costs a lot of money. Campaign polling is very expensive. Nothing like the media guys' budgets. I always remind them. But most campaigns have a pretty healthy media or polling budget, and an even healthier media budget. And we all know that for when it comes to media organizations, budgets are being slashed right and left. So they're having to take more creative approaches to their polling. It's been helpful, I think, for the industry. I think we've all learned a lot from it as some of the media pollsters have had to get more creative and experiment with different methodologies. We've all learned from it. But the downside is we've learned what works and what fails. But some of those methodologies that fail also get reported. So you just see different approaches, and that's why you see such wildly different numbers that forces people like us to release internal polling data. The other thing is who's reporting on it. So, Brian and I, neither of us joined this profession because we wanted to have our name on marquees or, be out there in the media. We're an industry of nerds. We're an industry of mathematicians, statisticians, economists. This is what we do. And we love it. We dive into the numbers and we do that versus on the media side, you have, experienced journalists, people that are great at writing stories, investigating what's happening. People that can always find the right word, but maybe they aren't people that took Calc 4. They aren't people that are really into mathematics. And those are my favorite calls. Sometimes when people in the press will call and say, "Hey, help me understand this poll." We're happy to help understand because we realize that's not what your background is. And the other thing is the media, as soon as the poll's out, they're on to the next story. They need to generate clicks for the next story. They need to move on to what's happening next. Whereas people like Brian and I, we are held accountable, even on campaigns that we win. There's usually a pretty in-depth postmortem on what we got right, think trends that we missed, areas where we may have been off, and then the ultimate accountability are our jobs. What campaign is going to hire us next? How accurate was our polling last cycle? That feeds into to what our future campaigns are going to look like. So all that said, campaign polls, we did see quite a bit of problems in 2020 as well. I'm sure Brian will go into this in more detail, but pretty much across the board. So underestimating Republican support. It wasn't just Trump, it was down ballot as well. So these are the 7 Senate races that we worked. There's only 6 shown. We're missing North Carolina, but the data is about the same. And so looking at this, 2020 presented a unique challenge because so many people voted early, as you know. We had record turnout with absentee ballots and in-person early voting. And so it changed the way we poll a little bit. Much earlier than normal, we would ask people, instead of just saying, okay, how do you plan on voting if the election were today? We would say, okay, how did you vote? And what is shown here is in each state, the light blue bar are people who have yet to vote. And when my interviewers would ask them, okay, how do you plan to vote? That's the percentage that would refuse. The percentage that would say, I'm not going to, not I don't know, but I'm not telling you. The dark blue bars, same by state, that's showing you people that have already voted. And those that have already voted that say, I refuse to answer how and tell you how I voted. So it's sort of makes you happy. It's the sanctity of the secret ballot, right? And the importance of Americans that we hold, that you don't have to tell anybody how you voted, but it causes some problems in polling. And yeah, these percentages aren't huge, but when you combine them with the equally small percentage of people who are undecided, you're starting to look at a pretty healthy chunk of the electorate. And we see that we showed 2 states just so you could read it, but it was the same people across these states who were refusing to tell us who they voted for. And you can see who they are. They over-index as seniors, they're women, they're moderate to somewhat conservative. These are not partisan voters. They're very independent. And what we saw, particularly as we got closer to the election, these groups very much decided to vote for status quo. Something got scary to them about a change. And so they tended to move towards Trump. They tended to move towards Republican Senate candidates and Republican House candidates. So this was a trend that caused us problems and that we weren't really sure how to allocate for. And I think explains a lot of what we saw with some of the surprises, particularly in the Senate races. The other big problem is turnout. So the biggest thing pollsters probably that keeps us up at night is what's the electorate going to look like? And I hope all of you guys got to tune in for Ann Seltzer yesterday. I'm sure she talked about this. She is an absolute pro at nailing the electorate and who's going to show up. And it was a big problem in 2020 because as we started to see in the Democratic primaries, we were having just explosive turnout, even with the coronavirus. Democrats were just really enthused in voting in their primaries, even after the presidential primary was settled in their competitive Senate primaries. And so what we decided to do is we decided to open our sample up. So let's go bigger and broader with the electorate and include people who traditionally don't vote. Used in the past, the biggest predictor of if you're going to vote today is if you voted last year. And so we said, let's throw that out the window. Let's open it up because we're going to have a lot of these Biden voters. Trump is generating all this enthusiasm among the Democratic, not even the Democratic base, among Democratic voters, that even those people that traditionally don't vote are going to show up. And what we saw when we did that is, yes, it did help Biden, but it helped Trump too. Trump had so many new voters in 2016, people that hadn't bothered to turn out for 10, 12 years. We didn't think he had more room to grow. But what we saw is absolutely he did. When we broadened the sample, we saw a lot of new Trump voters saying, no, I'm going to vote. I'm going to vote for Trump. It's going to be my first time. And I'm definitely showing up. And you can sort of see that here in the data. This data is from Iowa, it's from the Trump Biden race. Should have done like Sally, but the data looks a lot the same. And I know it's early in the morning, you're saying, why is she making look at fractions? We're already talking about math. Those aren't fractions on the bottom. It's looking at the last 4 general elections, how many times you turned out. For those of you that work with the voter file, we can tell if you showed up or not I know it sounds creepy. We can't tell how you voted. I could just tell if you participated in the election or not. And you can see when you look at super voters, those 404 voters, those are your hardcore, they're going to lean more towards Biden. This is Iowa data, obviously, that's why Trump's ahead. But if you go down all the way to the left, those 0 of 4 voters, they don't look a lot different. Those are still Trump voters. And that's sort of illustrating what we saw in the data. As we broaden the sample, yeah, it helped Biden, but it helped Trump almost as much. So I think a lot of the public polls that we saw, and we asked to follow up on to say, why is this so different than what the campaign's reporting? They typically included that middle to up, 2 to 4, 3 to 4, and 4 to 4 voters. So people that vote in general elections or more. Well, that's a different electorate than when you go broad. So I think one of the lessons learned is, how broad do you go? In 2022, is it going to shrink, or are we going to have another 2018? That's a lot of what we need to spend our time focused on. So what else we watched? I can get just really quickly, who's moving. So when you look at polls, yes, you got to look at that top line number. So for this data, obviously that top line number, all voters, the Republican gained, 4 points. But even more important than that is where those gains are coming. Like what jumps out to me is streamers. So people who stream their news and TV, we saw a 15-point jump. So even more than us touting, oh, our candidate's up 4 points on the ballot, we would be more focused internally on what are we doing online? What are our digital campaigns? It's clearly working. We're targeting the right people. How do we learn from this and make it stronger? And it matters. I think that was fake data, so I wanted to get off it so quick, just looking at the Hispanic women numbers. This is real data. So this is from the Arizona Senate race. So this is Martha McNally and Mark Kelly. And so you can see over time, when we look at trends, that's why it's so important to dig past the top line numbers and really look at, okay, who is moving. If you see white men, just one little blip, that's actually the summer of protests, tearing down statues, all of that. No big surprise. White women, incredibly stable. Mark Kelly voters from the get-go, and they stayed with Kelly. But the Hispanic men, this was a really interesting trend that we started to pick up in the summer in several states, but Arizona is the best example of it here. We really started to see McSally and Trump gain a foothold with Hispanic men, and it just continued to build throughout the fall. So that's why, even looking at the top line numbers, if you read in the USA Today, okay, so this candidate's ahead. There's really probably a lot more going on beyond that, and that's really what we're looking for internally. So we're not surprised on election day. So on election day, everybody thought, oh my gosh, Hispanics went for Trump, more than they did in 2016. Looks like it's driven by Hispanic men. Well, that shouldn't have been a surprise to anybody on our campaign, because we're watching that kind of movement here, as you see. The other thing that we look at that was really key to Republicans, I don't think that Brian had to worry about this as much on his side, was fall-off voters. And what I mean when I say a fall-off voter is if you give somebody a forced choice ballot, so Amy McGrath or Mitch McConnell, and they choose Republican, but then you start to give them options, give them a libertarian, give them an independent, and I will give my Democratic counterparts incredible credit on this. They're excellent at qualifying third-party candidates for the ballot, which really tends to pull quite a bit from the GOP. So when people are given those options, they might have been a Mitch McConnell vote on the two-way ballot, the McGrath-McConnell ballot. But when you give them that libertarian or that independent, they're going to choose that person. So it's important for us to study those voters to see who they are. And you can see this is actually an aggregation of all the races that we worked. Looking at fall-off voters, so they're not Democrats. You can see they're very unfavorable towards Joe Biden. They were very unfavorable towards the Democratic candidate in these races, but they loved Donald Trump. If you look at that top bar, they absolutely love Trump. So that's very instructive for us. So when talking to these voters, see where you are aligned with Trump on his agenda, or maybe there's a strategy about don't throw away your vote. Make sure you vote for vote against Biden. Or in this case, like vote against the Democratic candidate. So another really important thing, so when you're looking at polls, be them a campaign poll that we've released, which you should be wary of if we're releasing it, or media polls, how are they asking the ballots? So internally on a campaign, we always ask the true ballot, which is the full ballot, and then we will ask the two-way ballot if it was just a forced choice. But it's important to look at that and look at that drop off.
All right, thanks so much, Brenda. Brian?
Yeah, so that was great. I want to say a couple things here, just sort of briefly. I will say, and one thing I'll correct, rather than Joe Donnelly's pollster, we pulled for the DSCC and an IE in that race. But I would say, just starting off, I think everybody got it wrong, and I think we're kind of getting to that, but at least to some degree, right? The public polling we've all seen. Campaign pollsters in general didn't have anything different. I think you can look at some of the spending decisions that people made and sort of see that of, I haven't seen the Republican polls in South Carolina, but you don't put $140 million into a state as Republicans if you feel like you're convincingly up, right? So I think it was pretty across the board. I don't think we know why. I think we're getting to some of the conclusions. And getting to some of the reasons, which I'll talk about, but I don't think we have an answer yet. I think one thing we do know is that the error in 2016 and the error in 2020 were very correlated. So I'm going to show one quick graph on that. But this is, if folks can see my screen, this is a graph where on the left, right is how far a state was wrong. This is all the public data taken down. How far it was wrong in 2016, and on the top bottom is how far it was off in 2020. So you see this line going horizontal, sort of bottom left to top right, because they're correlated. And some of the states with the biggest misses in 2016 were also some of the states with the biggest misses in 2020. There's clearly a type of voter that we continue to miss. There are some counterexamples. For example, Texas, the polling was a little bit too Republican in 2016 and then switched the other way. Minnesota and Michigan got better. And we solved some of the problems in 2020 that existed in 2016 polling. It's not a one-to-one correlation, and some of the error was sort of muted. And one of those things is that high non-college or too high of education rates that we had in previous polling. But it's deeper than that. I mean, I think we tried to fix it with some sort of combination of what part of the state you're from and how educated you are, what type of job you do. One thing that we're looking at now is how trusting you are of people, which I think maybe education is slightly a proxy for. So we've done some polling in Michigan in post-election, and that seems to have really helped. We ask people if you trust people or not. Just do you trust most people most of the time, or do you not? And people who don't trust people tended to vote for Trump, tend to be underrepresented in our polls. So that's one theory of something that is part of the issue. I don't think it was turnout. I think turnout was a little bit of the problem. And I will say, at least our firm, we were basically polling all registered voters all cycle. And that's basically who showed up. I think we were all pretty convinced it was going to be a huge turnout election. We've done a deep dive into the Iowa voter file, which is a good voter file. It got updated early, and as you saw, was one of the states with a lot of the error. And we've sort of gone back and said, okay, who actually voted, and does changing our assumptions in the poll to reality change anything? And not really. It sort of makes polls maybe a point or two better, but there's still a problem there. So I think all of these things add up to a little bit, but there's no silver bullet. I think another thing, and maybe Jessica dropped it, or Christine dropped it in the chat, or I believe it should be here, but COVID played a role. I did analysis that shows that the higher the COVID rates in a state in October, the more pro-democratic the polling was. So that might explain in part why Wisconsin and Iowa were so off this year. They had a lot of COVID in October. Michigan and Minnesota were lower in COVID at the time, and states with big error in 2016, and we didn't see quite that error this time around. I don't think that explains it, but I think that you can see where response rates were incredibly high in the spring in polling. It went down by the fall, and you could see why people who were more concerned about COVID didn't pick up their phone, or did pick up their phones. They were not going out to restaurants. They were not sort of outside they're sitting at home, ready to answer their phones. And we know that voters that were more concerned about COVID voted for Biden, even outside of their sort of, general partisan leanings. I don't think there's all this conversation about low response rates. I am not convinced that that is our problem. I think it's something we're still investigating, but some of the very high quality, high response rate polls did not seem to do any better, that were sort of longer term and longer, with big incentives and stuff like that, where they're talking to way more people that they reach. They're getting them on the phone or online or through the mail or whoever else they're doing it. Still had some of the same problems. We did a lot of surveys this cycle. This is something I heard Tony Fabrizio talking about yesterday, using different modes, whether it's an online panel, whether we texted people and had them respond to us in text, whether we texted them a link to a survey. Theoretically, you should get different types of people responding to those surveys, and we do see that. So, a text survey gets fewer seniors, for example, but none of that really solved the bias, even though you're getting different types of people responding, and you should have different non-response bias. They still all were pretty pro-Biden. So I think that this is a long-term issue, and you saw it play out in a lot of the down-ballot races in particular, where particularly I would say House races, but also Senate races, especially in a state like Iowa. Arizona polling much better. North Carolina, Georgia polling was very good. But I think this is just one of the things that we're going to have to say may continue to exist in polling, and probably has existed. And we sort of look at polling to be accurate within a point or two, and pollsters are guilty of sort of, being part of the problem and trying to convince people we know everything. But maybe it's a little bit less certain than that. So I think we're looking at what to do in 2022. I'm looking forward to that conversation as to how to improve things. But all of those problems that were there in the Trump polling that we all know about were there and worse in the down ballot polling, because in part because there was so few people that voted for one party in one race and then went down the ballot and voted in a different way.
All right, thanks, Brian and Brenda, for both of those thoughts. I kind of want to jump off there where we're talking about the presidential effect. I mean, polling during polling down ballot races in a presidential year is obviously very different than polling down ballot races in a midterm year. And of course, the biggest misses that we've seen have been the Trump era in 2016 and 2020. And I know some of the panelists yesterday sort of talked about this too, the Trump effect, that, he brings in sort of voters that are harder to reach, that are wary of pollsters. And, we haven't necessarily seen those voters turn out when he isn't on the ballot. Alabama Senate race, the Georgia runoffs, the 2018 midterms. Do you all think that this was sort of just a blip that Trump happened that sort of made things a little off skew? And, how are you, I guess, looking ahead to that, or, for 2022 and, whether he runs in 2024, does Trump just sort of skew the whole thing in a way when he's on the ballot?
Oh, yeah, I'd say absolutely he does. And I think we have pretty concrete proof of it. Having, had Trump on the ballot twice in the midterm, he is just an incredible turnout machine, both for Republicans and for Democrats. He's turned out so many new voters, and I think it's less that we're not able to reach them. I think for too long, they've been excluded from our samples, because we've always said, okay, these people don't turn out, but they get fired up and they turn out for Trump. But we see that does not transfer. In 2018, he tried, in several races that we ended up taking a beating in. So his voters, and we get into this a little bit later, they sort of see Republicans, Democrats, and Trump. They're not necessarily, it looks like it tends to be shifting a little bit, but they're not necessarily loyal to the Republican Party, they're loyal to Trump. And the biggest evidence of this is when he went for the, in the Alabama, in 2018, and he went down there to campaign for, I want to say Tupperville. I'm blanking on the guy's name. And we
Strange.
Thank you. And they had people leaving the convention center saying, I'm still going to vote for Roy Moore. So, I mean, he can't necessarily transfer his panache. I do have to put one little disagreement if we don't get into it. In Iowa, I don't think Iowa was a tough state to poll, and we got Iowa right. And if she's listening, God bless you, Ann Seltzer, because everybody internally was knocking the crap out of my poll, saying Ernst isn't up by 4. And so when she came out with that, it was such a plus.
Brian, your thoughts on sort of the Trump effect? Because, we saw a lot of, and I think it was on both instances, House races specifically seem to be very off this cycle.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, we've seen in past elections where, Republican and Democratic polling has varied hugely, but you can just look at the money of where the NRCC and the DCCC and the super PACs were spending. They wouldn't have been spending in some of these races if they weren't seeing troubling polling. So, they can talk about, we saw this coming. No one really saw, Republicans expected to lose House seats. They did not expect to gain this much. So do you factor that into sort of that Trump effect? What do you think sort of caused that disparity in Democratic polling and perhaps in Republican polling too?
Oh, for sure. And Iowa was a great example of that, where Republicans pulled out of Iowa 3 against Cindy Axie, my client. They probably spent less than they should have in Iowa 1, which they ended up winning in Iowa 2. So in 3/4 of the state, right, their polling was wrong on the campaign and independent level. I think, and I agree with the point that in 2018, I will say the polling was better. It wasn't perfect, and some of the fact that
there were some misses, certainly. I sent it and stuff when I was going back and looking. I think some of the House polling was a little better in 2018 than some of the polling.
Yeah, the House polling was much better, and I also think to some degree Democrats were expected to win everything, and Democrats did win everything. So we kind of look at it less, which I'm a little bit worried about this time, right? Especially after winning Georgia and having the trifecta. Do people sort of forget about this as we sort of, get comfortable in a majority? I don't think so, because the majority is so narrow. But I definitely think those voters are going to continue to be a problem. The question about 22 is, a lot of people turned out in 18. I mean, it was a historically high midterm. Does that go back to 10 or 14, or does it look more like 18? I don't know. I think a lot of Democrats in 2018 kind of won some of those anti-establishment Trump voters, right? They kind of picked up some of them, or they were more. You look at somebody like Gretchen Whitmer, like she did well in places like Macomb County, where Trump did incredibly well. And Obama won a lot of those voters too, which is why I think we didn't see this issue in the polling before. I mean, Obama got a lot of those kind of screw you voters, right? That voted for Trump. But yeah, I think it's gonna be a problem. I think it could go away. I think we could overcorrect for it. But yeah, I think it's gonna be a problem in 22. We got to continue to address it. Can't just assume it goes away because of Trump.
Yeah, I want to dig in more to one thing you said. Sort of, do you all worry about this sort of overcorrection after 2020, going into 2022?
Yeah, I mean, I could see it with Latinos, who we also saw being a problem in 2020. We did a lot of polling in South Texas and South Florida and in Arizona. We saw that our margins were sort of going down. I could see Latinos bouncing back and us not sort of accounting for that in our polling. I could see us sort of expecting a sort of white non-college turnout that doesn't materialize. I could see any of those things. Brenda, what your thoughts are?
No, absolutely. I'm really worried about an overcorrection, particularly in 2022. Being a midterm, I don't think it's going to be what we saw in 2018. So yes.
Yep.
Sort of going back to we all sort of expected this blue wave happening, but what we did see was largely that we've seen such a decrease in split ticket voters, though. In 2016, every single Senate race went the same way that the presidential race did. In 2020, it was everyone except for Susan Collins that defied gravity. Fewer House districts that are split between, Trump Republicans and Biden, Trump Democrats and Biden Republicans. Was that sort of wave imaginary, really, do you think, that was created by polling, and sort of was it sort of fed, I guess, by what was going on, that we looked at, disaster after disaster, that it sort of looked like there was no way that Republicans could recover, especially with many Trump missteps? Brenda?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Well, I think there were two things. I think you did have, like I talked about, a lot of the polls coming out that saying, Republicans don't have a chance. Trump is dragging everybody down ballot down with them like an anchor. And then fundraising, like we got spanked in 2018 and 2020 for fundraising. So at some point you say, how can you beat a candidate that has outraised you by 40, $50 million? So Democrats are just likely to win this. But I think that it really comes back to like who turned out. Like it wasn't as big of a surprise if you saw, okay, everybody agreed, turnout's going to break records. But if you see that doesn't necessarily, like I already said, only help Biden, like that's actually you're going to have a lot of new Republicans coming to the fold too.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think there is a little bit of a question between polling data and expectations. So in Iowa, for example, we expected high turnout and we expected that to be bad for us, right? That the intermittent voters were bad for us. So even when polling was sort of suggesting we might do better, we were not anticipating that to happen. But so we polled in, I worked with two of the, I think 6 Democrats who won Trump districts, Cindy Axie in Iowa and Ron Kind in Wisconsin, which were also epicenters of error. I do think that there was a huge sort of crossover voter, especially for somebody like Ron Kind, who has historically, run a big margins in Trump districts. And with the turnout being so high, that was really muted. There just weren't, people were not paying as much attention. They just kind of voted the top of the ticket. And that is part of what magnified the problem in the House races for a lot of these Democrats who won Trump districts, right? A Joe Cunningham, a Kendra Horn, a Xochitl, that.
Yeah.
Yep.
I will say that we didn't get back to the first part of your question. Like, this is a huge problem. And what we're seeing today, this hyper partisanship and people saying, well, I can't vote for you because you have an R next to your name, or I can't vote for you because you have a D next to your name. So I think this is a fundamental problem that just within our bigger political ecosystem.
Brenda, what do you think happened with Susan Collins? Even Republicans I was talking to, they didn't have great polling showing her, if she was up a little bit, but because of ranked choice voting, I know they really didn't expect her to break 50. What do you think happened there?
I can tell you what I think, but I didn't poll it. Brian, did you poll it?
No.
So what it looks like happened is Susan Collins, everybody had her ahead, but not hitting 50.
Right.
And so then ranked choice was going to hose her. So the fact that, she pulled out that extra support and got to 50, it really shows, well, Maine kind of is a good example. Montana used to be one, sometimes still is, of what we're just talking about. It doesn't have that hyper partisan feel. They really do, people love to tell us in focus groups, I vote for the person, not the party. That's really not true. But you have in a couple of states like that, where there is sort of that more independent libertarian streak, where they do split the ticket. So her hitting 50, I think a lot of it helped. I thought she was going to be hosed because of the Supreme Court vote, but at actually how quickly that faded from the national conversation really, really helped her.
We know polls are a snapshot in time of when you do them. And we had so many waves of different things happening in 2020. Could you talk about how you saw your polling change with some of those events, the beginning of COVID, and then, a marker that I think that stands in my mind that, when I was talking with Republicans after it, they were just apoplectic, was Trump's horrible first debate performance and him getting COVID. And then sort of what you were saying at the end, because it does feel like maybe there was a rebound there at the very end of the month that, maybe some polls missed. Like, were you seeing it still really bad? Did you see that reflected really bad at the beginning of October?
Yeah, so that's a good point. And I think it's easy to blame late movement because then you escape any accountability, which is seductive. But definitely, if you look at the exit polls, the people that decided in their last week broke to Trump. The people that decided in the last month were pretty split. But I think that's right. I think that he certainly consolidated some of the undecided voters or people that looked at the whole way he handled getting COVID and the debates as, sort of made him shaky for him, and then they came home. But it was like 30 campaign cycles in one, right? It's like you had okay, well, now we can't poll because people are getting locked down. Okay, now it just, now the sort of deaths are going up, and now, and then the the George Floyd situation, and that really showed up in our data as different than Kenosha. And then it was just, it was crisis after crisis. And I feel like that happened in 2016 for sure with Comey, and then with the debates and Access Hollywood in October. But this time it was like that for 10 months. So I feel like every call I was on with a client was saying, well, now this is a moment in time and we don't know what's going to happen in a week. And look what just happened this week. So I definitely think that it was a challenge, and just even getting your bearings of where anything was going.
What about you, Brenda, as a Republican? Did you see a difference in that beginning of October versus later?
Absolutely. So there were a couple of key moments in time. And one was sort of in the late summer when Trump and Ivanka and Jared decided to walk to the church across the street and the protesters back asked. And that's when you really started to hear those conversations in the campaign, like, okay, when do we make this a check and a balance argument? Like, okay, he's going to flop this, and we're going to have to say we need a check on Biden. And then the second one was you did see a rebound. It really started in early October, and it continued throughout the month. And something became, I have a theory on what it is, but I'm not 100% sure. Something became really scary about Democratic control. And so you had all of these voters saying, no, I'm going to vote for the status quo. I don't want a Democratic president, Democratic House, Democratic Senate. So we did start to see that sink in. And I think it's when you saw all the campaigns really pivot to here's what's scary about Democrats, and it was very targeted. So in Iowa, it was Green New Deal. Other places, it was defund the police. But you really saw, what's scary about the socialism argument that a lot of Republicans were using, and why Democrats stayed relentlessly on the same message. I used to always joke, if I was a Democratic ad maker, I would say, please don't tell me to make another ad on pre-existing conditions. Like, they were relentlessly on healthcare, where Republicans started to splinter out, and so people started hearing new messaging that was scary to them.
They do say that.
The defund the police was one that, in retrospect, a lot of Democrats have sort of thought that was effective, sort of at bringing Republicans back into the fold. Did you all see that, in retrospect? Do you think that, that was something that was, I look at that slogan and it's badly worded, really, because it's not defunding the police when you get down to it, but you put it in an ad, and people go, I think especially a lot of suburban voters are going to go, I don't want the police to go away.
We saw it was massive in our data, and that was a lot of that spike with Hispanic men too. I don't want defund the police. We like the police in our neighborhoods. We did see it with suburban voters. It was pretty universal.
What about you, Brian?
I think the policing stuff was definitely something that was coming up on the negative side a lot. And it, especially on the timing of some of the protests. Yeah.
Right. The role of polling versus analytics in campaigns too. We saw this obviously in 2016 with the Clinton campaign. I was talking to some campaigns and they were sort of using analytics or predictive analytics to do this. How do you deal with that as a pollster? Do you think that campaigns have become sort of over reliant on that? How can it inform, decisions within campaigns too?
Well, it's like a big fight in campaigns, obviously, sometimes, but it doesn't have to be. And I think sometimes it works really well. And I think that, look, we also had the advantage of, as Brenda said, we were fundraising like crazy in the top of the ticket and in down-ballot races. So we could do both, right? And I think that was really helpful when we had analytics, models and sort of real-time sort of measures of support. But then also, we were doing deeper polls, which I think has been criticisms of past Democratic campaigns. We were doing deeper polls to look at, okay, not where are we, but sort of who could we lose, who could put us in trouble, and how do we make sure we're talking to those people? And that's sort of, I view that as the more strategic role of polling, which frankly is a lot more important. Like I'd much rather we overestimated Biden's vote share and he wins than we get it right and he loses, right? Both are important, but I think that was a strategic aspect that was true in House races and Senate races and governor's races as well. I mean, if you look at North Carolina, for example, where we outperformed the top of the ticket, I mean, that understanding sort of who that voter was and how you hang on to them is really, really important.
What about you, Brenda?
I think analytics are super important. Our firm does them too. But just like Brian said, I think they have a role. And I think too often campaigns just get too cute by half. And especially when you look at modeling what the electorate's going to be, we can only have 2% of these voters. And I think we really get in trouble with them. I think they are great for building audiences that then we can go target with digital advertising or, whatever it is. It's important to say, okay, here are your defund the police voters. Here's your healthcare voters. That's important, but analytic polls are not campaign polls. And I think it's really cute when they try to present their top lines. No, Mitch McConnell does not have a 62% job approval. If he's listening, it's because it's 68. But I mean, their data is just so skewed because they're not pollsters and they don't look at things the same way we do. That said, I do think it's helpful. It's important to keep it in perspective and where it should be applied.
I want to ask one question about governors, and I wanted to do two questions. Brian, you pulled for Gretchen Whitmer, who's up for re-election in 2022. There weren't a lot of governors races on the ballot during a presidential year and things too, but how do you go? I mean, polling those two, do you think that we saw a spike in approval ratings with how governors handled COVID? Could either of you sort of talk about that and sort of how you think that could play into 2022? Will that still be an issue? Because I think that, voters, especially sort of in the absence of leadership from the White House, they really relied on their governors, and you had some that stepped up and some that didn't from both parties.
Yeah, and I think when you look at why Trump did much worse in Michigan than in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania after doing exactly the same, I certainly don't discount his just desire to pick and repick fights with Gretchen Whitmer as part of that. But I think I think the governor's races are very different, and we work for John Bel Edwards, who is a governor in a deeply red state, and then you look at Charlie Baker, Phil Scott, Larry Hogan, right? People are just so much more movable, and the partisan lines are not so clear, but also the demographic lines. Gretchen Whitmer did very well among non-college white voters who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, right? So I think that in Senate polls and in House polls, often we have an understanding that if we see some really strong group with someone, but the partisanship is probably going to take over, and sure, you have a quarter of Republicans right now, but you're never going to hang on to them. Once sort of $100 million in attack ads go back and forth. That's not necessarily true in governor's races. So we have to keep a lot more of an open mind about who our targets are in those races, because people just don't retreat to the partisan corners in the same way.
Right. That's the one group that does seem to be, you can distance yourself more from the national party. You're not electing someone that is going to go vote in the Senate for a certain majority leader. How you saw Phil Scott and Chris Sununu win big while Trump lost those states very big too. Brenda, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is huge. And one of the overlooked points, I'm glad you brought it up, of 2020 is that we saw that huge governors that were communicating with the electorate, their numbers just spiked up. Even Governor Bullock in Montana, you had Bashir, you had Como. We do a lot of work in California. Newsom actually hit highs before his new lows. Governors that were communicating really did well, as where governors that were more quiet, like Ducey, were starting to plummet. But then you also got into trouble. So we saw what happened. We're seeing what happened now in California, and Bullock sort of overstretched what Montanans were comfortable with. And where he was giving his press briefings, he was super popular. Once he started implementing safety precautions, his approval plummeted. So those were some of the most, in North Carolina too. I think that's why Cooper came out so strong in the beginning, and they just couldn't catch it. But those were some of the most interesting data lines to watch for the governors.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Brenda, one final question I want to ask you too is, we had this Supreme Court fight happening so late and different things, and I think a lot of us expected that it could have a major impact. Certainly it raised millions of dollars for Democrats. Did you see though that, perhaps it brought, I feel like I think you said it didn't matter in a lot of races, but do you think that it could have caused, some in very Republican states where we did have Democrats that were, sort of inching up in like South Carolina and Montana? Do you think that reminding them about judges and different things, and what McConnell has made sort of his priority helped in some of those red states where you did have Democrats sort of on their heels.
Well, so we were hoping it would, because traditionally Republican voters care very much about judges and they care about the Supreme Court a lot, whereas Democrats tend to put it as a backseat issue. Now I'm worried about education, I'm worried about healthcare, Supreme Court, not so much. So we expected to see that this time, and we saw actually the inverse. First of all, it didn't generate, it wasn't like a Kavanaugh level. You know, everybody really liked, what are we calling our ABC? Everybody sort of liked her. She was a likable person. So it didn't generate as much controversy to begin with. But the people that did get enthused about it or call it a voting issue were Democrats. Republicans kind of brushed it to the side. So it was problematic at first, but it didn't last long.
Okay.
So I totally agree. I mean, we did, as I mentioned, the IE in Indiana in 2018, and it was just, you couldn't escape it, right? And I remember I worked for Billy Sutton, who was running in South Dakota for governor, and being in a hotel or doing focus groups, and just heard people talking about it in the lobby. And I was like, this is bad news for us, given our Senate map and stuff like that. But it just didn't show up in the 2020 polling in the same way. I mean, the money showed up for Democrats for sure. And I think that also part of it was that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had an appeal to Democrats, and replacing her like that kind of fired up Democrats more, whereas that just wasn't how 18 worked. But I agree, the hearings were just less contentious, and sort of that piece of it. You could make an argument that it saved Susan Collins, which I'm uninformed to make in terms of if it mattered in the polling, but I didn't see it make major changes in any other Senate race.
Okay. All right. I want to go to some questions from the audience. Let's see here. Jessica Lieberman from New Politics. Given what we saw in 2020, what should down ballot candidates be looking for or asking their pollsters in 2022?
Brian, you want to take it?
Yeah, sure. So I think a big piece of it is sort of what are you changing and what are you doing differently and what have you sort of learned from this? And I'm wary of anyone who says they have the answers right now, because I think there's still a lot of thinking to go on, but I think you want to see your pollster thinking about these things. And I also think always important from a pollster is a little bit of humility, right? I think this is true in terms of running this ad or that ad, or, or being in this market or that market. I mean, the data isn't ever perfect. And so I think having the ability to sort of step back and be part of a team and make decisions like that. But I think indicative of that is a pollster who sort of doesn't come in and tell you, well, I know everything and I'm going to get everything right, and like, you just have to trust me and it's all going to be perfect. Like it never works like that, right? So, Brenda.
Yeah, I would agree. Like I said, we're accountable. We have records. So I'd ask how you did in 2020, and what were the margins you called your races for. But I'd also ask, which Brian alluded to, and I think you alluded to in one of your questions, Jessica, like, what else are you doing? I mean, the days of just like, phone polling are over. So what new innovative strategies are you taking? I get they're all not going to work, but what are you experimenting with? I think that everybody should be asking their pollster that now. If you're still, you're still faxing respondents.
We have Frank Spring from Undaunted and Ventured. One of the points John Anzalone made yesterday was that the margin was less instructive than the Democratic number because, quote, Democrats get what they poll, largely holds up at the presidential level. Is there an explanation for outliers like Maine, where Sarah Gideon underperformed the polling average? And maybe take that, what are you telling people on a down ballot? Is it, they also talked a lot yesterday, both Anzalone and Fabrizio did, about looking especially not just at the margins, but at the approval ratings. How do you look at that, and how closely do you see it correlating when you have an incumbent running or a new candidate that you're working to define? Brenda, especially, I feel like that's especially true in perhaps Iowa, because we saw Ernst's approval ratings drop. Greenfield spent a lot of money early on, but then I think Democrat or Republicans were sort of able to define her there too.
Yes, I'm happy to talk to that, but I do not want to put words in John Anzalone's mouth. I will leave that for his team. So I'll let Brian take the first crack at that.
So I think, and I think that comes from John having a lot of experience in the South, where that is very, very true. I think it's sort of case by case thing. I think that it is especially true early on in a cycle. I mean, I can remember, gosh, we pulled for Jason Altmaier, who barely hung on in the 2010 wave, and his first poll is 51-20 or something against then challenger Keith Rothfuss, and he won 51-49. And you could just kind of never get above 51. And I think that that was true in 2018. That a lot of Republicans who weren't polling at 50 went down. I think that there's error past that, certainly in polling. But I think that especially when you're a challenger or when you're an incumbent running against a little known challenger, your vote share is much more important than the margin.
Yeah, I would vote share. And I think job approval is key.
Mm-hmm.
So where you are at that, pollsters always ask this question, and I don't know why I hate it. Should you reelect so-and-so, or is it time to give somebody else a chance? Everybody always wants to give somebody else a chance. It's all about who is that warm body we're putting in to give somebody else a chance. And then it's up to us to define them. So like in the Greenfield Ernst race, Ernst started out pretty popular when Greenfield won her primary. She skyrocketed as Democrats really came back to support her. But then you have, the SLFs of the world that jumped in and helped define her. And she could never really get her image off the ground as her negatives were spiking up as well. So in that case, it's all about just making sure Joni Ernst hangs on to what she has and knocking down Greenfield so she can't define herself.
Here's an interesting question. David Goldstein from Peppercom asks, what about the lack of Democratic get out the vote efforts due to COVID versus a robust Republican get out the vote efforts? How do you measure that in polling? What impact do you see that it has?
I would respectfully disagree a little bit. I think the Democrats' turnout machine is pretty enviable and was pretty on the money. And they did a great job of saying, hey, there's lots of different ways to vote, and here's how you could do it. And they have some amazing leaders in their party. Stacey Abrams is just no matter if I don't disagree with or agree with hardly any of her policies, but I think she's a champion when it comes to get out of vote. Just amazing. And look, on the flip side, you had the other leader of our party saying that this was fraud, and there's no way that you should vote early and you have to show up on election day. I think that probably hurt us more than anything. Obviously, because we didn't have people. Traditionally, if you look at early vote, if we look at when we break down after the election's over, here's people who voted absentee, and here's who they supported. Here's people that voted on election day. Here's how they voted. It nets out to the same candidate. The margins might be different, but the same candidate won early vote that wins on election day. That was nowhere close to the case in 2020. Democrats won across the board, even in places like Alabama, on early vote, where Republicans won across the board on election day, even in places like Hawaii and Maryland. So it's just, that's going to be an interesting hangover from the Trump legacy. Or do Republicans ever go back to feeling comfortable absentee voting again? Are they forever election day voters? And all of those early votes on the Dem side, do they keep turning out and voting early? My hunch is yes, because I think the Democrats have built a pretty good turnout machine.
So I totally agree that that's a real structural advantage that we have right now, and we'll see how it plays out. But I also very much agree with the point that Democrats had less of a face-to-face GOTV effort than
I think that's what he was referring to. Yeah.
I don't think they had less of a GOTV effort, though. I think that it was made up for in a lot of other ways, whether those were text, whether those were phone, whether those were mailing people absentee request forms. And I mean, you saw, what Biden got 82 million votes or something like that. I think our turnout was quite good. We've done some post-election polling in places, and there wasn't there isn't this huge universe of people who got contacted by Republicans at the doors and didn't in Democratic. So I don't think that's a major factor.
Yeah. I'm going to jump in and ask a question off of this that I didn't get to, because one of the things Ann Selzer talked about yesterday, the discrepancy between our September and our October polls with the Des Moines Register, which the first one showed a tied presidential and Greenfield leading Ernst. Then, that final sort of shock poll showed Trump and Ernst opening up wider leads, which I know, Brenda, your polling mirrored that. And, I think a lot of us didn't expect that. She attributed some of that to Democrats' push to get the early vote out versus, in the poll picking up that, and then the October survey capturing Republican voters getting to the polls. I know, Brenda, you touched a little bit on that, but and Brian, I think this goes to your point that you wrote about COVID. Like, how difficult was that? I know, Brenda, you showed the slides about the response rate to try to weave together, because we had such a massive early vote versus trying to measure the Republican vote. It was almost like you were sort of looking at two different electorates almost.
We absolutely were. And that sadly is what has allowed Trump to perpetuate that, because everybody went to bed thinking that, depending if you counted your early votes first, or if you didn't count them till later, people thought they knew where these races landed, and they didn't. But no, we absolutely.
I mean, we know that races are never called like they're by the morning. Sometimes we know that.
If we could only just get the electorate to get there. Wait till you wake up, and then maybe a couple days or weeks if you live in California. But no, I think we saw the same thing in Iowa. We saw the shift, and I think she's right. Some of it was the early vote. I think a lot of it was President Trump's visit to Cedar Rapids too. That really helped Ernst with an audience that for whatever reason she'd been struggling with.
I come down differently, and sort of, and there's no answer to this question. We don't know necessarily, but I thought polling was pretty stable across the cycle, and it moved a point or two. But it is remarkable when you look at the presidential race, how, especially March and later, how consistent Biden's advantage was. And I don't think a lot of the Senate races moved a ton. So I don't know that I think Iowa changed 8 points in 3 weeks. I think it was probably always a Republican advantage. And I don't know if that means Ann's first two polls were off, or if that means that it was all somewhere in the middle and you average them out, or what. But I don't think this race sort of dramatically fell off the table for Democrats. I think it was always what it was.
I can tell you where we had it. So we had it pretty even in late September, very early October, and then mid-October, it moved to the +4, +5.
Okay. Yeah.
A question from Noah Pransky from NBCLX. What effects could overpolling cause in bellwether communities when you've got so many campaigns and public polls surveying national, state, and local races?
I mean, it's a problem. Look at Montana. I mean, they have the presidential, the gubernatorial, Senate, the House. It clearly is a problem. It's a problem with response rates. And I think it's incumbent on us, one, with an area where we need to get more creative with our polling, not just be calling everybody on their cell phones, and two, get these committees to come together to share data, to pull the races. But it also means enough with the 20-minute polls. Yes, we have to test messaging and strategy, but you have to be respectful of what these voters are going through. My parents actually live in Montana, and my mom took a picture of her direct mail from one day, and it was just, it was mind-boggling. So I think it's incumbent on us as campaigns to work together up and down the ticket as much as legally as we can, but also to realize what's happening here. And to get creative. Steve Bullock, I never thought I'd see it. He did newspaper raps. I mean, half the students listening to this don't even realize what a newspaper rap is, but figure out different ways to reach voters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel bad for everybody in Maine. I mean, one, how many ads they were seeing, but two, especially if you lived in Maine too, which, talk about swing voters, by the way, the number of Golden Collins voters.
Yeah.
But gosh, the amount they were getting polled, or 75% of Iowa that was in a swing congressional district, and the Iowa State House was heavily contested too. So it was, you were getting called, and the presidential was polling in both those states, and particularly in Maine too, right? So it was brutal for people. I think it's a problem.
A question from Shyam Subaranian, and I apologize, I probably did not pronounce that name right. How do pollsters decide which subgroupings are electorally important? And I'm going to add a caveat here that I'd be interested in saying too, and goes along with this question. We talk a lot about the rise of, suburban women, especially we saw in 2016, and, when we drill down to some of those suburban counties, 2018, and certainly in 2020. Can you talk about how you're polling too, not just in the, what subgroups you decide, but how you're polling specifically in the suburbs and of those categories has changed over the past few cycles?
I mean, we couldn't find a Democratic voter among suburban men, and now they're pretty split, right? So it's women and men shifting, women more. I guess I would say we look for changes over time among groups. So if we know a state very well and we see things changing over time, that's one thing for us. We look for, we'll ask people who they vote for at the beginning of the poll and then give them information. And if they change their mind throughout the poll, that's a group that might be important to us. We ask people, we ask them if they are open to changing their mind. And if they say they are, we mostly take them at their word. So there are a lot of different ways we go about it for persuasion targets. And then people who we focus on turning out is a little bit less of a polling question and more just sort of that's where I think analytics does play a much bigger role in the sort of math of the voter file and all that.
Yeah, I would agree. It's completely like who we see moving around, both from poll to poll and throughout a poll. Well, okay, as I learn new information, I'm moving on this candidate, and that really, if they're a big enough chunk of the electorate for us to look at, that really drives all of our decisions. Like who's open, what do they want to hear about, what do they want to learn, and as far as getting at suburban voters, it's key. I mean, the spreadsheets that Brian and I probably use to target our samples are just intense. So I think Arizona is a great example where you have so much of the vote that's targeted in Maricopa County. It's not just enough to say, okay, I'm going to talk to 500 people in Maricopa County. Like you want to talk to so many in downtown Phoenix, and then you want to talk to that suburban and rural Maricopa County, which equally exists. And like for a Republican, that's where you win Maricopa County. We're not ever going to win Phoenix, so you sort of set it aside. So there is a lot of targeting on the front end. We're targeting specific groups like that, or like when we saw that uptick with Hispanic men, then we went back online and really targeted Hispanic men. What's going on? Like why are you all of a sudden open to Trump or McSally or whoever it is?
Yeah, I actually like to add one thing on that, because you made a point, and I agree with all that. You made a point about Stacey Abrams earlier in Turnout, but I think equally as important in her 2018 race and why she was close and why we won this time around is she did very well with white college graduates in the suburbs, right? And she was quite popular there. And I think that is especially true of Warnock and of Ossoff. And that was a big piece of some of these voters. And we work for Carolyn Bordeaux in Georgia 7. Those white suburban voters are a big piece of why Georgia is changing too. And I think that she was a good example of somebody who did not sort of just do one. You got to do both in a state, in most states, but certainly in Georgia.
Well, that is a good segue into our next panel. Especially, I think, the Hispanic men, I think was one of the big takeaways I had, sort of the changes that we saw with that, and Black voters. And our next panel is race, demographics, and the future electorate with Fernando Armandi, Matt Barretto, Kathy Cohen, Terrence Woodby, and moderated by my good friend and former NPR colleague, Juana Summers. So that'll start in about 5 minutes. And thank you so much to Brian and Brenda. We could have gone on so much longer for a really informative panel. We really appreciate it from all of us here at the Cook Political Report and the University of Chicago Institute of Politics. Thank you all.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. Bye.